I think self-love is not, it's not so much a, you know, a word that's kind of stands still. It's something that I think we have to actively and intentionally engage in with a level of consistency. Otherwise, it's like the muscles atrophy. And I think a lot of times that's what happens. You know, you might say, oh yeah, I love myself, or oh yeah, I agree with that idea. But so much of the time people don't actually exercise it, and so it's kind of at a standstill, and it's not evident in our lives. All right.
Welcome everyone to the Vegan Posse Self-Love series, which is dedicated to expanding our tenderness, affection, curiosity, and general delight in one very important animal, ourselves. As many of you know, I'm currently working on a companion guide to my novel, Marrying Myself, which will be sort of a self-love playbook. So in the process of creating this Marrying Myself companion guide, I realized I had a wealth of wisdom in the previous guests I've had on the show. So I decided to invite some of them back on to talk specifically about self-love and what it means to them. Today, I am thrilled to welcome back Kylea Rorabaugh, whom I first met in 2020 through Dr. Pam Popper's Wellness Forum Health. Kylea is a licensed professional counselor in Kansas City, Missouri. And at the time, she was running a weekly telephone support group for people like me who were struggling to make sense of what was happening in the world following the declaration of a COVID-19 pandemic. That support group was a lifeline for me during those very strange and isolating times. And for me, being part of that group was a huge part of my own self-love practice. And in fact, it was after my Vegan Posse interview with Kylea in 2022, which was in fact only the 6th interview on the podcast, I decided to go to grad school for a degree in clinical mental health counseling. So now, a year and a half later, I'm getting close to being done with my coursework, and I'll be beginning my practicum and internship in May of this year. So Kylea, in many ways, I have you to thank for that. And so Kylea, as you may recall, I start off the regular episodes of Vegan Posse by asking people if they're ready for the ride of their life. But for this special series, I would like to ask, are you ready for the love of your life?
Beautiful. Yes.
Good. Right answer. So today I'd love to hear both your personal experience with self-love and your clinical perspective as a counselor. And one of the questions I have for you, as I mentioned, I'm in grad school now, as you very well know. And for my current research class, I decided to do some formal research on the concept of self-love to find out if it's a real thing or more of a fluff concept. So what's your perspective on that issue?
I definitely think it is a real issue, not a fluff issue. Um, However, I think it's oftentimes misconstrued in a lot of ways, and I think it's used so liberally in situations where it's lost its meaning a lot of the time. And so sometimes I think when people hear the idea of self-love, it's kind of a concept that's blown away, or just kind of a whatever, that self-love thing. It's been diluted in its nature. But I think that it holds a great deal of value. And I think if it's looked at in a way that I think has a deeper meaning, it can impact us in notable ways, both in our mental health, in our physical health, in our spiritual health, across the board. I think it definitely holds a lot of value.
I tend to agree, of course. So tell me a little bit about your own journey of self-love. Is self-love something that came easily to you, or did you have to work for it?
I think originally, as I was growing up in the early years of my life, I think it was much more of a struggle, and I didn't, in an immature child or teenager, even young adult life, I didn't really have a clear understanding of what healthy self-love was. And I think a lot of times part of the unfortunate nature of what self-love implies is people have this idea that it's some, vain conceit if you have a level of self-love. I come from a background and even currently from a Christian perspective, and a lot of times it's downplayed where, oh goodness, you wouldn't want self-love to come into your mind or into your life because that implies that you're putting yourself first in front of everybody else. And how could you do that? That's not right. And I think that goes back to the way that we look at self love. And so, if we're looking at self love as I'm number one and I'm amazing and wonderful in every capacity, yeah, I'd say that's a problem. But I don't think that that's what self love actually means. So, with that perspective in mind, I struggled in my earlier years, but I think as I've grown and matured and aged and had a whole lot more life experience, I think self-love has been something that I have had to develop, but in a healthier way in terms of recognizing the things that I have that are at my disposal that are character traits or strengths or abilities or talents or giftings. And when we can focus on those and utilize them in ways that demonstrate I'm a valuable person and I have something to use to impact other people, I think that's much more so the way that I look at self-love of I have unique qualities and abilities and talents and they're different than other people's. And if I kind of hide those or I don't recognize them, then not only am I not living up to my potential, but I'm also refraining from sharing those people or those things with other people, which also means that I don't foster the desire in other people to perhaps do the same. So I think
Mm.
that's one way that I would look at self love in terms of my own development. And I think there, and we'll probably talk about this, but some of the other facets of how I have exercised or implemented those, that's been a learning journey. But I think that I'm far better now than I was, 30 years ago. I hope I am.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. So in some of the research that I've done, I found one study that identified three components of self-love. So I'm curious what you think of these, or maybe you're even familiar with this study. It was a qualitative study, but they came up with three components, which they listed as number one was self-contact, defined as giving attention to oneself. Number two was self-acceptance, defined as being at peace with oneself. And three is self-care, defined as being protective and caring for oneself. So what do you think of that ingredient list? Is there anything you think is missing?
I think that all of those are very, very important pieces of self-love because again, that's the kind of more of a definition that's actionable. Those are things that we can exercise. They're things that we can recognize about ourselves. It's something we can strive for. And I
Mm,
think we are consistently getting better and better at learning to love ourselves in a different way. And I think that's one of the things that in all of those areas, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that, but in all of those areas, that's something it's ongoing. It's not like we've arrived and then we stop. And I think that that concept of continually working within each one of those fields um, enables us to keep that mindset of I'm going to work to be better at this. I'm going to strive toward more excellence in this. And as we do that, we learn. And as we do that, we strengthen those muscles of self-love, if you will. And I think then we experience the benefits and the positive consequences of that, despite the hard work that's involved. Because I think it takes a lot of work. It takes great intentionality if we're going to actionably love ourselves in that fashion. And so I think that that's a very well encompassing definition or kind of ingredient list, like you said, that does make kind of create that recipe for being able to actionably employ self love. Because I think self love is not, it's not so much a, a word that kind of stands still. It's something that I think we have to actively and intentionally engage in with a level of consistency. Otherwise, it's like the muscles atrophy. And I think a lot of times that's what happens. You might say, oh, yeah, I love myself, or oh, yeah, I agree with that idea. But so much of the time, people don't actually exercise it. And so it's kind of at a standstill, and it's not evident in our lives.
Right, right. And I think you make a great point that it's not just a feeling, it's not just something, an emotion that's enjoyable and pleasant and that we feel all the time. It's about action and a muscle that we can work. So I have my own thoughts on this question, but I'm curious what you would say on this topic. How would you distinguish self-love from narcissism?
Oh, that's a great question. Uh, and actually, narcissism is something I have a lot of experience with in terms of working with people in relationships in which narcissism is an issue. Um, it's a great question. Um, Narcissism is so centered around the self. It is centered around I'm always right, my way or the highway. It's centered around my pleasure is the utmost importance. It's kind of a game in a way where I win every time, whether it's I win every argument, I win every opinion, I win, I win, I win. It's a very self-centered approach. And another element that I think is so key about narcissism is it's not only self-centered, but it's at the expense of everyone else. So the people that person comes into contact with, they pay the price for that self-centered mentality. Self-love, I think, has components of, yes, there is an emphasis on the good parts, the valuable parts, the characteristics and traits and abilities and talents. It's looking at the self in a very positive light, but I think it also allows us to see where we maybe are weaker, or maybe areas that we don't have the same level of strength, and accepting that as okay. We don't have to be the best or the expert in everything. But I think the key element that stands out as a different facet of self love compared to narcissism is, yes, there's a focus on self, but it's not at the expense of others. It's actually at the enhancement of others. Because when I show up in that best version of who I am and I acknowledge those things, it's to the benefit of other people. And it also impacts other people in such a positive fashion. And so it is, yes, there's a focus on self, but it's never at the expense of other people. And it never presents harm or detriment to another person. And so as I grow in my self love, other people should grow in a way from that ability in me, or that exercise in me. Other people should benefit and be uh, inspired or impacted to do the same for them as well. So I think those are the key elements of difference.
Right, right. I love that way of framing it. It makes other people feel better and bigger and
Yes,
to shine brighter rather than making them feel
right.
small, which is the
Yes,
effect of someone being around someone who's narcissistic.
yes.
Um, so I'm curious, you've been happily married for a long time, so you've got that traditional love story. How do you maintain your sense of self-love in your relationship?
Oh, you have such great questions. Yes, so I've been married for 24 years, and I would say that that's a journey too. And I think in terms of self-love, if you are in, so for me, in a marriage situation, I think that your spouse has the opportunity. Now, that doesn't always happen this way, but for me, in my experience, um, your spouse has an opportunity to consistently and intentionally encourage or bring out those pieces that perhaps you don't recognize. And so I know over the years, my husband has pointed out many things that I would never have seen as a strength or as a quality that I would see as something positive. And he helps me reframe that oftentimes. And this is I think much more so in the earlier years of our marriage, where I was maybe more insecure. I was much younger, obviously, and I think we have those blind spots. And so, what in my relationship, my marriage, my husband has had the opportunity and has done a very good job of pointing out the things that maybe I saw as a detriment, and he saw them as something, an opportunity or something good in me, and encourages and fosters those things as time goes on. I think also it's enabled me to see areas that perhaps I could do better in and take care of myself in a much better way as well. And that kind of goes to that ingredient you talked about, the self-care piece. He's really good about pointing that out in me of, are you really taking care of the valuable person that you are? And I think particularly in a profession like I'm in and that you're going into, that is such an important piece of the self-love journey, is making sure that we don't always put everybody else in front of ourselves, and we fail in that area of nurturing and taking care of the beautiful creation that we are. And so I think a lot of times in a marriage relationship, there's that opportunity to have that vulnerability and pointing out areas perhaps that I struggle or I see as a weakness, and allowing somebody else to come alongside and say, maybe your perspective is a little bit skewed, and let me show you a different perspective. And I think that can foster self-love too, because self-love isn't about seeing yourself as some grandiose, amazing perfection, because none of us are. We're not perfect people. But that doesn't mean that we're so flawed because we're not perfect at everything. So I think it's kind of a built-in accountability, and it's a built-in second person to say, hey, I see this in you. Maybe you should start seeing that in you as well. And I think that's been a big component of our journey together, and vice versa. Obviously, you want that reciprocity to be able to say and do the same things. It's kind of like a workout partner in a way, if we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about it in terms of
Mm-hmm.
muscles, you have somebody else prompting and encouraging and pointing those things out.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And this is where my head immediately jumped when you started talking about how your husband helps you see things about yourself. My head immediately jumped to assuming that those were negative things, not about you in particular, but obviously the what I would be afraid of in that position myself. So
Right.
so
Yeah.
I love that it was more along the positive line of somebody, your husband seeing the wonderful things in you and helping you nurture those things. I mean, that sounds like a good marriage.
Yeah.
Rather than the nitpicking and pointing out every flaw or every human failing. Should
Right.
be tough.
Well, and that actually, I think you bring up a really good point, because obviously, in every relationship, there are going to be those nitpicky things. No matter how great your marriage is, there's always things that annoy you or bother you or that you see. And I think those in a good, healthy relationship, those too can be part of the self-love journey, because again, we don't want some grandiose or unrealistic version of ourselves either, because that's not realistic. It's not, we're not perfect people. And so I think part of self-love is recognizing that though we have flaws or though we have areas that we can improve in, that doesn't go to the value of who I am as a person. It goes more to the willingness to be honest about those things and to want to improve for the sake of being the best version of yourself. And so I think that that can fit into it as well. And certainly in 24 years of marriage, obviously there are things that I have pointed out and that my husband has pointed out that, hey, you need to work on this. But I think part two of self-love is when that kind of a thing is spoken, it doesn't go directly to, oh, I'm a terrible person, I have no value, and I'm not worth anything. It goes more to, I see. That's something that could help me become the best version of who I am, rather than allowing that to be a value statement on my worth.
Right. Right. Yeah, one of the things that I have thought a lot about is abandonment. And, so many people, so many of us have abandonment issues, and we're so worried about being rejected or being shunned or excluded or discarded. And yet what I realized for me was that in the present day reality, the number one abandoner was usually me. I was abandoning myself because I was ashamed or I was embarrassed or I didn't feel like I was good enough. So I'm curious, Kylea, can you relate to that at all? Do you ever have struggle with abandoning yourself, or are you ever tempted to abandon yourself?
I would say I definitely have had periods of that in my life. And again, I would probably point to some of my earlier years where that insecurity was very present. I would say definitely in the early years of my practice, I felt like that a lot, of feeling like just kind of in that mindset of abandoning the things that were maybe important to me because I felt like I had to be somebody that I wasn't, or I had to be an expert in something that I was just learning. And so I think a lot of the time it came down to my career, and that's what instigated that. I have an incredible family. I have a great husband. And so it didn't come so much from those relationships, but it came from that drive for success or the feeling of I was actually helping people or I was doing what people needed me to do. And so living up to the expectations of other people in a career sense. So
Mm,
I definitely experienced that early on. I would say every once in a while, maybe there's a kind of a hint of that because obviously, even now, after being in practice for as many years as I have, it still, I think, still sometimes crops up in terms of feeling maybe inadequate in a really difficult situation or feeling like, oh my goodness, I don't have the expertise that's necessary for that, even though I've been practicing for almost 20 years. So I think that definitely does play on our, or maybe kind of breaks down on that self love sometimes of feeling like abandoning the things that I have valued or the things that I do have on behalf of the things that perhaps I'm not quite as skilled in, or maybe my confidence is a little bit more fractured in that sense. And so, yes, I think it's something I think if we're honest, all of us struggle with that on some level. And I think it's exacerbated if we've experienced something on a personal level. If we have that abandonment in relationships or whether it's personal relationships or family relationships or work relationships, across the board, I think anytime that we have a foundation of that, we have the tendency to doubt our our quality or our value just from an internal kind of deeper level. So I definitely think that that's something we need to guard against and be specifically aware of, particularly when we get kind of that hint of it in the back of our minds rather than shoving it aside. That's a good place to pause and say, oh, what's going on with this and where does this come from, and is this attacking kind of my sense of self-worth and self attention and self-love. And most of the time, yeah, there's a hint of that, but if we pause and we stay in that place and actually allow some of those thoughts, feelings, and struggles to come to the surface, it's something that again allows us to exercise those muscles.
right, right. That makes total sense. So in your counseling practice, I know you do at least some cognitive behavioral therapy. Is that would you consider that your theoretical orientation? Is that like your
I
primary
would, yes.
focus?
And
Okay.
sometimes I use some other approaches, but yes, that's my
Sure.
central.
Okay. And how would you say that CBT, plays into this concept of self-love and cultivating it?
I think it's huge. So I actually just yesterday finished up a series on self-worth and discovering what that self-worth is all about. And I think self-worth sometimes is kind of interchangeable with self-love, but I think a lot of times we have a misguided representation of what that means. But I think with CBT, it fits like hand in glove. It's so perfectly placed because one of the key central concepts of CBT is recognizing the foundational beliefs that we have about ourselves, about other people, about the world, about life in general. And so one of the key elements that I work with people on is what our foundational beliefs about ourselves uh, what those things are, absolutely influence every aspect of our lives. So if I have this belief that I am not valuable, or I am damaged, or I'm broken, or I'm always messing up, or I'm a failure, then that clearly impacts my ability to love myself. And so from that foundation of belief, I then start to have thoughts of, oh, I can't do that. I'm not worthy of that. I can't apply for that position. I certainly couldn't attempt that relationship because I'm not worthy and I have no value and I'm a failure, and on and on and on. That then impacts the way that our emotions go. We're probably not going to be vibrant and magnetizing in terms of drawing other people to us. And then our behaviors are going to reflect that as well. And so within the CBT kind of framework, I always want to start at the foundation because, and essentially, if we're talking about foundational beliefs about who we are, then that's a discussion about self-love right there. And one of the things that I will oftentimes start with is, all right, so let's talk about what I call the beauty of you. And the beauty of you implies that there are foundational beliefs that underlie my belief that there is beauty in who I am. And I'm not talking about physical beauty, but the internal beauty that we have. And recognizing what is it that makes up that unique beauty within who you are as a person. And the reason, and that might sound like overly simplistic, like, is this just a Pollyanna version of, I'm really not very good at this. Oh, I'm going to say I'm an expert. No, it's not that. It's actually specifically not that. But it's a recognition of the value that I do have and looking for that, searching for that. Sometimes as a therapist, I will have somebody say, I can't think of anything. All I can think about is the failure and the things I do wrong and the things that are bad about me and all of those pieces. I can't find anything else. That's obviously an instance in which somebody has a very damaged version of self-love, or maybe an absence of self-love. And so sometimes I'll step in and I'll say, okay, let me set the stage and let me point out some things in you that I see to start that. And sometimes it'll take some time for that person to even be able to connect with that. But most of the time, they'll be able to build on it, even if it's just a little bit. And we start that journey toward finding and discovering the things that are inherently valuable about them and the worth and the beauty of the uniqueness of that person. And so that is a central concept, because if I start to say, instead of I'm a failure and I mess up at everything and I'm damaged and I'm broken and all of those things, and I start to say that maybe I point out a strength. Well, if I can start to grab hold of that, then everything else is going to have that domino effect. So that's a very central construct. It's something I do with just about everybody when I work with them because it's foundational. So that's an example of how CBT actually really connects with that concept of self-love. In addition to the fact, I will say, is that much of the time, somebody will say, I can't believe that. I can kind of maybe see it on the surface, but I don't know how I'm supposed to start believing that. And so we work a lot on just a simple phrase that starts to exercise their mind in that new language, and it's practice and it's consistency. And what I talk about is it's training your mind in a different direction about that self-love, and starting to see a different version of who you actually are, as opposed to that version that there was no self-love, there was no acknowledgement of the beautiful parts about you. So those are a couple examples of how I use it, and also how CBT in general really connects with that concept.
I love that. And I know for me, CBT just on a personal level was really transformative, even without seeing a counselor in CBT, because I first encountered it through the book Feeling Good by David Burns, I think is the author's name.
Yes. Yes.
And I started doing this CBT writing exercise where I would write down my negative thoughts and identify the distortion. Am I predicting the future? Am I reading somebody's mind? Am I reasoning through my emotions? And then replace it with just a more productive thought. And for me, it really was it was mind blowing just because what I loved so much about it was, like you said, it wasn't just substituting. It wasn't just sugarcoating things and replacing
Right.
some grandiose, less than accurate
Mhm.
thought
Yes.
in there. I could be
Yes.
honest. I could admit when I'd fallen short, and then also realize, you know what? Is that really the end of the world? If I'm not the best person on the planet at
Right.
this thing, is that the
Mhm.
end of the world? Chances are too that I can get better at it. If it's really bothering me that much, chances are I can improve it. I can increase my skills or my craft or whatever it is. So
Exactly.
yeah, I personally have found CBT super helpful. And again, that self-honesty piece for me is what, without that component, to me CBT would be missing like the integral piece. Because after all, how can we truly accept ourselves if we're not honest about who we are? If we're lying
Exactly.
to other people or lying to ourselves. Um,
Exactly. Yes.
so you've got some teen boys. Are they still in their teens at this point? Or are they?
Yes, I have an
Yeah.
18-year-old and a 15-year-old. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And how would you say that they're doing with self-love?
Oh, another great question. I would say my older son is much better at it than my younger son, if I'm honest. And he tends to look for every beautiful thing in every situation. He has
Aw.
a wonderful skill of that, and he's so good at doing that in other people too. He's the one who's going to notice things. He's going to be the one to point out reasons why you should have a healthy self-love. And so I think I would say he has mastered that skill. And he's able to recognize too. I think this is something, he has wisdom well beyond his years in this regard,
Mm,
in that he can see the things that he needs to work on. He can see areas that he's not as strong, and it doesn't impact the way that he sees himself as a whole. So he
mm.
can recognize, yeah, I'm not so good at that. And that's okay, because this over here is my strength, and I might want to get better at that. And it might just be something that I'm willing to accept is not my area of strength. So he is, I think, amazing at
It
that for an
sounds like it.
18-year-old
Oh
boy.
my goodness. Yeah. If I'd had just like a nugget of that, that would have saved
Yeah,
me a lot of
I
angst.
my younger son is he's a freshman in high school, and he struggles with it a whole lot more. And I think it's partly personality. He has a little bit more of the melancholy to his personality. And so he tends to focus in on the things that are his flaws.
Hmm.
And as a mom, it's a little heartbreaking oftentimes, because I see all of the beautiful, wonderful things about him. And I think it gives me an opportunity to really intentionally seek to point those things out, but also foster those in action. So asking him to do things that I know that he will notice his strengths. And also, I think another aspect of it is he may have to work harder at something, or he may have to put more effort into something, or into that mentality. But one of the things that I point out in that regard too is that even in that so-called weakness, he can actually see a strength. And an example would be, he is a very hard worker in school, but school is not as natural to him as my older son. My older son is incredibly intelligent and doesn't have to work nearly as hard. He works hard, but he doesn't have to work nearly as hard. He's much more academic. My younger son, it's a struggle, and he works so hard and he puts in so many hours of work, and he gets good grades, but he has to work for every single bit of that. So to
Mm.
him, the struggle has been, oh, I'm not smart. I don't do as good of a job. And he compares himself to his older brother a lot. And so one of the things that I used that example with him of, you know what? You may not have the same natural capabilities, but the beautiful thing about that is that you are developing a work ethic, you are developing a need to really work hard and have that determination, that perseverance, that grit to accomplish a big goal. And that is a trait that will serve you in so many different aspects of life. And so, even in those types of areas where he struggles and he sees himself as maybe not as good at, or struggling in, he it's a good opportunity. It takes a little bit more work, but it's a good opportunity to foster that just in a different way. I think we have to get really creative sometimes when our kids are struggling with that, and finding
Mm,
what's that niche, what's that thing that we can step in and
mm.
foster and allow to blossom. So very different kiddos.
Right. It sounds like it. They sound so super sweet. And
I appreciate
they're
it.
lucky to have you for a mom to
Well,
actually,
thank you.
share these principles with them. And so tell me, for you, how does veganism relate to self-love?
Yeah. So it's so perfectly placed in this conversation, I think. And I was thinking about that as I was considering, what how does that fit out? How would I actually describe that? And I think a couple of key elements stand out to me. So with what we put into our bodies, the things that we eat, the things that we consume, the things that we engage in, things of that nature, I think self-love also, it's not just the emotional, mental piece of things. There's also the physical part of that. And so when I think about how I'm nourishing my body, veganism fits perfectly into that. Because if I value who I am, then that also implies that the physical part of me is important. And if the physical part of me is not in optimal health or shape, then I won't be able to do the other things that exemplify the self-love that I have. And so I was thinking about, if I am going to nourish my body in the best way possible, I'm going to choose the things that give me that physical nurturing. And eating a vegan diet is one of those things, because I know where everything comes from. I know that my fruits and my vegetables and my grains and all of those things come directly from the source of where they were grown, instead of the animal laden processed things that not only make me feel horrible, but they also are not nourishing, and they don't enable me to do the things that are important, or to live out those other values and qualities that I think are important. So I think another element of that is, just from the mental and emotional aspect of things. My mind is not going to work in a way that I have the energy to do the things that I need to do to take care of myself, or even to see myself in the light that I think I should. And I think another piece of that puzzle is, I started the vegan journey because of health reasons. That's where I started. And I've always had a compassion for animals, but for many, many years, it was, oh, I love animals, but I'm perfectly happy to eat animals as well. And so I've been a vegan for about 10 years. Yeah, I think it's been about 10 years completely, and mostly vegan for about 14 years. And so when I first started, again, it was health reasons. But over time, I've recognized that it just doesn't mesh with my value system anymore to eat anything that's living, a creature. Obviously, plants are living, but in that sense. And so I think another element of self-love is adhering to the values that are important to you. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in pandering to the values of another person, or I don't want to offend somebody, so I'm going to kind of back out of my values for the sake of somebody else, or I don't want to offend, or I don't want to upset, or I want to people please. And so we let go of some of those values. But if I say that something's valuable to me, then I need to adhere to that. And I think sometimes we fail to do that, and in so doing, we show up as a inauthentic version. And I don't think that that demonstrates a self-love, because it's distancing ourselves from who we actually are. And so I would look at it much in the same way as if I have Christian values, for example. If I'm like, well, I'll kind of exercise them over here, but not over here, well, then that would kind of present me as a phony, as kind of a synthetic version. And I don't think that that fosters self-love. So if we believe that we're valuable people, if we believe that we have worth and the things that are true to us, if those are violated or we kind of are wishy-washy about that, then we're not presenting ourselves in a true and authentic manner. And so I think with veganism, if I say that that not eating animals, of not killing animals, of not harming animals in any way, if I say that's important, but then I kind of dabble in it over here, then that it's like there's a dissonance to that, and it doesn't allow me to live in an authentic manner. So I think that's how I would see it, is not only do I want to nourish myself with the best things that there are so that I can fulfill the things that I want to do, so I can live a long life, so I can have the energy to do what I've been called to do, so I can show up for my family, so I can have a vibrant life. I have to feed my body with the things that are going to allow me to do that. And I think that's all encompassing with self-love. And then also that second facet of, I need to adhere to the values that are important to me. And if I don't do that, then I demonstrate I'm not worth it to do the hard work of employing that.
Yeah, I love that. That makes so much sense to me. And I know that before I went vegan, I'd been vegetarian and was very reluctant, not eager to go vegan, but I'd been learning more and more about the industries and was feeling increasingly uncomfortable continuing to eat those things. But again, I was just so reluctant to to go vegan. But like you said, that niggling feeling at my conscience just wasn't going away. And I knew it wasn't going to go away. And to continue living with it was going to mean shutting myself down. And like you described so eloquently, just ignoring my own values, ignoring my authentic self, and basically just continuing to live not in integrity. That's what it would have
Yes.
been.
Yes.
So yeah, I resonate with that quite a bit. All right, Kylea, well, final question. What do you think the number one thing people can do today to love themselves better?
I think the starting point is kind of, I'll allude to what I had mentioned before, is giving yourself a moment to just pause and to really allow your mind to go to those places of, what is it about me that makes me who I am? What are those strengths and gifts and abilities and talents and character traits? What are the positive good things that I see? And what are the things that maybe are not so much my strengths? Maybe I consider them my weaknesses or my struggles, because I think that honest representation that includes all of those pieces is so important. Because like you said a moment ago, it's an honest reflection of who we are. We don't want some skewed view, whether that's on the positive side or the negative side, but it's the all encompassing, like looking at every aspect and seeing those weaknesses as not flaws, but rather I wasn't created to do those things, or it's an opportunity for me to get better at those things. And so looking at both of those, and if you can't do that, if you can only think of the negatives, then ask someone that you trust. Ask somebody who loves you, who knows you. What did other people say about you? How,
Mm,
what are the compliments you receive? What are the things that
mm,
people point out about you? And that sometimes will start the mental engine and being able to determine, okay, well, even if it's one or two things, it's a start. But I think it's that honest review of all of those pieces, because what that enables us to do is, all right, these are the things that I'm really good at or that I am gifted in. How can those things foster a sense of self-love, but also how can those things maybe stand in or overcome some of the weaknesses that I have? Or thinking in terms of, am I attempting to fit into a mold, maybe a mold that society presents or the expectations of other people? Am I trying to do that? And if I'm trying to do that, then I'm probably not paying attention to the things that are inherently part of who I am uniquely. And so
mm.
that also is another piece of it, is that sometimes I fail to see the good things about me because I'm looking at all the things I can't do or the mold that I'm not fitting into. And so I think really self-love has to start with an honest representation and really thinking through, what is all of that? And what do I want to do with that? And what do I want to focus on? That's a beautiful launching ground for then, where do we take that from here?
Brilliant. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And for me, part of that process too is recognizing if our scale is off,
Yes,
because
that's a
we don't
great
want to
point.
be overly positive about ourselves, but at the
Right.
same time, if we recognize that we tend to err on the side of being very negative, then maybe we can, practice
Exactly.
erring a little bit in
Beautiful.
the other direction, just
Right.
just to experiment.
Exactly. Yeah. Excellent point.
Well, Kylea, thank you so much for joining us for this special self-love series. Thank you for being part of my own self-love journey, both in inspiring me to go back to grad school and for, being a support system during those crazy, crazy few years that we had.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you for letting me join with you. It's an
All
exciting
right.
journey.
Well, go forth and love yourself.